So, dear people in the room, there we go. You've seen Grahame already. He's here. Works all the way from Australia. And this is a birds of a feather session, which means that it's meant to be like to present some kind of novel ideas or things that we're thinking about. So there will be more open questions and issues than there are answers. And the whole idea is that we're having an interactive session, you know, so Graham's going to talk about better managing sets of resource. I think I have an idea what that's about. One of the long-standing open question, I think, in FHIR, and probably something you'd recognize. So it's just about discussing those issues here today. To make this interactive with someone who's not here, it means that you will need to use the mic, otherwise Grahame won't hear you. So if you're in the back and you're planning to participate actively, you're going to make me run back and forth quite a lot. There is a second mic there. So if I am over there and someone here in front wants to talk, it's probably better to get down to that mic over there so we can keep stuff lively without me having to run all the time. All right. With that said, Grahame, I'm giving the word to you.
Hey, thanks very much. So each Dev Days, I bring a design question to the group for commentary. Sometimes it turns into bits of the specification. So this subject today basically goes back to a discussion Ewout and I had just after we published release 1. And we said that in release 2, a focus for us would be to figure out how to properly deal with sets of resources. Well, here 5 is just around the corner, and I don't think we've made much progress on this one. So just to give you a bit of sort of background to this. By the way, you've probably heard me say this by now, but it's super frustrating not to be standing in front of you in person. I went 2.5 years without getting COVID and then got it on the exact day that would mean that I couldn't make Dev Days. So that's what happened. And I probably got it at a health IT event here in Australia, which I thought, should I go to that? I should really not go to that. Should I go to Dev Days? And then I got asked to go to that and I said yes. And there you go. Okay, so almost any actual real world activity generates showers of resources. Just lots of them. You know, like if a clinician sees a patient, they're doing a ward round, or, you know, a patient walks into their consultation room, it's not going to be one resource that's produced. It's going to be a series. It's basically going to rain fire resources everywhere. Well, how does that work? How are they linked? How are they assembled? How do you describe the set and how they relate to each other? And how do you manage them? And like I said, back when we got release 1 out the door, Ewout and I said to each other, that's the big thing that we need to solve. We really need to deal with this. We still really need to deal with this, really. We've got some tools, and I'll talk through the tools that we have, and I have a proposal to make, which we'll talk about. But really, who knows what other ideas we can come up with. But basically, the scenario is a clinician sees a patient. Let's work with this as a working scenario. There's like myriad variations, but I think they're kind of the same thing in practice. A clinician sees a patient. He spends some time doing SOAP, right? Tell me your story, observe symptoms, make some observations, do some analysis, a differential diagnosis, decide on a care plan, and then recommend a set of actions that are going to be taken. You're going to audit all of those things with provenance resources. You're going to get a set of observations, conditions, a care plan resource, maybe a modified care plan resource, probably with modifications, tracking the modifications. You might get some medication requests, you might get some service requests, you might get immunization recommendations, a bunch of resources like that. So when you go and look in the resources, when you create the resources that will be looked at, how do you link them all up together? So here's some possible approaches to linking resources up. You can give them all a common encounter link. Every one of them links to the same encounter, and you have a micro encounter for the specific consultation. Now, working across vendors, there's quite a bit of variation about encounters, but I certainly have worked with vendors who do exactly that. They have micro encounters. They have an encounter resource for every like minute by minute interaction. If you're in a ward round and you walk up to a bed, bingo, that's an encounter. Everybody on the ward round, and then you'll have, you know, nested layers of encounters. I've had other vendors go, this is kidding me. There's no way we're doing that. That's crap. But certainly like the design intent. And so then you know that they're all linked to that little session minute, 2 to 3 minute thing, because they've all got the same encounter link. This is one way to link them up. I do not recommend all of these approaches. I don't recommend, I mean, I specifically don't recommend some of them, and I don't recommend to use all of them at once. Another thing you can do is just create a provenance resource for the entire session and just list everything that gets created in the target of the provenance resource. And so then the target set of a single provenance resource is the target set for the session. Another thing you could do is build a list. And as you do each thing in the session, the transaction, whatever it is, and you just tack them all together in the list. And so you've got a list that corresponds to the list of everything that happened in the session. Alternatively, you could use a composition. And specifically, this is what I originally intended when I first put composition in the FHIR specification. So the composition organizes the set of things that happen into a single composition. Now, HL7, because of our kind of institutional history, all the work in FHIR has generally tended to think about composition as a document construct. And so mostly you'll look at all of our work around document, the committee that owns it now, which was not my original choice, and all of the profiling, and you'll see that it's all document bundles with a composition as the base. But actually, the first design take that I did on composition, I used composition from 13606 as the basis of the design, and the name is still based on 13606, and the composition in 13606 is the wrapper element for a set of changes that represent a coherent interaction with the EHR. And so that's what the composition resource is. And it was our original intention, my original intention anyway, that composition would serve double duty: the backbone of the CDA document, equivalent construct, the document construct in FHIR, and also the backbone of the transaction construct in FHIR. And you see, transactions like a tricky word in that sense, because double duty, because we tend to think about transactions at a database level, but I'm not talking about the database level transaction there. I'm thinking more at the human. I had a session of work, I did a bunch of things, and then I saved it. And that, like, we know as developers, we know there might have been a bunch of stuff going on in the background with the database and system and a bunch of CDS hooks and all sorts of things happening in the background. When the user says, now I'm done. This is my thing that I added. That's what the composition represents. So really my intention was that you'd use the composition, but you could use the document reference and use the document reference to tack everything together and say, this document references all these resources and this is a document for this session. So you could do that. And you could even use communication. I ran out of silly ideas after this, but you could say, I'm communicating to the EHR, and the communication is all of these things that happen in this session. I put that on with a specific hope that I'd get under Lloyd's skin with that idea, and that he would, yeah, I can see that I have, so that's good. So, I mean, those are the not truly stupid ways that I came up with of linking them all together. And they serve different purposes, and you might choose to do several of them. But like I said, composition. That was that was what my intention was. So I'll stop at this point before I go on. And anyone got any comments, questions? Pretty much Ewat's going to run the discussion. It's pretty hard for me to do that from here, so Ewat can sort of take over. But yeah, have we got anyone want to talk about any of this so far?
If you stop talking long enough, I will.
No, I'm not going to stop for you, David.
Oh, crap.
Okay.
Your first one, the common encounter link, is one I ended up using for a logical model I had to use. The primary reason for that is I was dealing with medications pre-op, intra-op, and post-op, and medication didn't have any way to demarcate that. So I created a pre-op encounter, which didn't, I mean, there was no real encounter there, but all tied to the master encounter of they're getting this operation. It's a pre-op encounter, a post-op, and tied all the medications, all the resources to that. But I do like I mean, I've never heard of composition used as anything from except, you know, a document header, because I've lived a sheltered life. And I think that's a much better idea than the way I did it. And I may have to go back and fix that in my use.
You could. I mean, everybody should go and read the 13606 description of composition to fully understand. Well, see if I can find it quickly. 13606 definition of composition, and to understand exactly how they think it's used.
It's really worth reading anyway, 13606. I think you can download it for free, although it's like is it the ISO standard? Yeah. I have some, no, I don't have free copies.
Yeah, so they talk about a folder. We didn't directly produce folder in FHIR, but we kind of had document manifest for a while, which is kind of folder-ish, and we had a list as well, which would be a list. But we didn't really, I didn't find that to be a tremendously useful thing. So but we have compositions with sections, and then the entries are in the sections, and then we get down to actual resources. So in that sense, the composition was always intended to follow 13606, and the definition is here, which I'll just make nice and big. The set of information committed to one EHR as a result of a clinical encounter or a record documentation session. So meet your definition there, David. And examples are blah, blah, blah. Some of them are documents, but not all of those examples are documents. So yeah, I think we should presumably do more to expose the 13606-ness of composition to the group.
Hey, Graham.
Hey.
What is our objective in linking all of these things together? What do we want to be able to do with the data that is linked that we can't just do by saying, find me everything that was created by so-and-so on this date? And so that's question number one. Question number two is composition. I have always thought about as being primarily about storytelling, in that it's organizing information in a way for presentation to others and conveying narrative about that presentation. And that doesn't necessarily seem like what we're wanting to do here. So that's not so much a question as a statement, but I'll let you respond to that too.
It doesn't have to be narrative based, but it can just assemble the resources into a structure that you can navigate and understand the relationships between them. So that's the first thing. But you can use it for storytelling and narrative presentation. And if you read 13606, the notion of a commit to an EHR is not entirely unrelated to telling a story. And in fact, there's an argument that it's always what you're doing. You're telling a story into the EHR with a bunch of supporting data. So you know, it's one of the reasons I mashed them together and said composition is inherently narrative based, so that you have the flexibility, but you don't have to have any narrative. You can just say, this is the data assembled in groups. Then get back to your other question. Sure, you can pick a time period and say, the doctor was seeing the patient between 10:35 and 10:45. And because that was happening, any resources created in that time are logically linked to the actions the user took during that time. But we all know that record creation is asynchronous with real life. And so just because it was created at that time doesn't mean that it doesn't relate to that set. You know, people go back and finish off the documentation later. Well, then you have Dave's example, where you actually have a logical commit that spans a bunch of other activities because it's tracking a particular perspective on that activity. And then finally, even I can assemble a set of data. I've got all the relevant resources, but I'm still missing context. So say I have a bunch of claimed conditions, the conditions I came to a conclusion of based on my assessment, the conditions that I would use as a criteria for decision-making purposes. If all you have is a list of condition resources, how do they fit to the picture? And the composition is what can assemble that and say, here's my observations, here's my so forth. Of course, some of those properties will be reflected into the condition resources, but I don't think all of them will be, particularly not when you're referring to conditions that were observed elsewhere as evidence, because you're not observing the conditions. I shouldn't use the word observation there, should I? You're not saying that those conditions, you're saying they were claimed, but they were claimed to be conditions when they were claimed to be conditions. You're making the claim. There's a whole bunch of context here that's really tricky to pin down. And that's why it's simply not enough to get a list of the resources in their raw fashion.
Yeah, right. I think it introduces a little bit of context that a human understands, but that's not explicit in that context, right? So that's probably why also a human being has to compose this stuff. I wonder, because in some of the EHRs I've seen, there's actually no way to express this composition. You can't really input it, right? There's the concept of this kind of composition is just not there, except if you gather them together based on date and you know the same doctor had input some data. So I also wonder, even if we can communicate this, I think there's still quite a lot of EHRs that even don't allow their users to input this composition.
So that's true and false. Certainly, some of the levels at which the EN 13606 composition is envisaged, EHRs don't bother with that sort of stuff, right? You just work with the EHR, and they're not doing that sort of thing. But there are other dialogues and wizards and workflow screens in the EHRs that assemble a bunch of resources that are implicitly doing this, even though you don't think of them as explicitly doing it. And they do correspond to the 13606 EHRs, and they're kind of, you know, in the EHRs that I used to maintain, we would have maybe 10% of our screens were effectively doing composition stuff rather than just editing a resource.
I'm really nervous about the idea that composition changes meaning or interpretation of data at all.
Yeah, but welcome to the real world, because that happens. I mean, when the need happens.
Well, I mean, we have the ability, if a condition has a particular relationship to an encounter, that relationship is represented on the encounter. Putting it into a particular section in a composition doesn't do anything. It might change how you're presenting it to the human being, but it doesn't change the computable semantics of how. No,
but it helps you understand. It helps you understand what's going on with the condition. If you look at the condition resource itself, we have its status and its properties of the condition, but what you don't have anywhere, and this is a common question, is perspective of the condition. Is this the primary diagnosis? Because the primary diagnosis, right, we hold that as a property of the encounter. And so what I'm saying is there's a whole bunch of ad hocness around perspective of condition, and it could be any other resource that is going to live somewhere. And it can't, you can't say that because we put something in a particular place in a composition that affects its meaning when you're holding the resource, but it does affect its meaning in the context of the composition. That's what I'm claiming.
If you want to know that condition A is primary for encounter 1 and secondary for encounter 2, you go look at the encounter. You don't need condition at all for that. So right. I'm not really following.
So, but I'm saying that we did that specifically and explicitly for encounter. Mm-hmm. But if you're talking about like a clinical assessment, and then that's not the property of encounter. It's something else that's going on, and we don't have any way at the moment to capture those kind of things. And that you do that through one way we can do that is through composition. I mean, we do have a type here for clinical impression, which I sort of strayed into the space of clinical impression, but clinical impression is presently not going anywhere because it's a bit of a ambitious beast for the way people are currently thinking, but I think it will become important in the future. And so here you can see that a condition is documented as a finding of a clinical assessment, clinical impression. Yeah. But it could also be a documented problem. So okay, fair enough. But the example I gave that you could do in composition, you can do a clinical impression specifically. But unless you claim, unless we say that we're going to create a resource for every one of these things, we need a generic way to assemble the logic of the relationship between them in the things that aren't explicit in the resources, but are the workflow you're doing using the resources. Unless we're going to have hundreds of resources for all these workflows, what are we going to do?
I don't think we need hundreds of resources, but I think we need explicit resources and not composition.
Well, we'll see about that. So I could have said, I should have added to this list clinical impression then, shouldn't I?
Hey, Graham, it's Dan. I was just going to give one other example of your first possible approach, of these like micro encounters. So the Passio project, which is kind of focused on the post-acute care space, has taken that approach with an IG that was just balloted in January. I'm not sure exactly where it stands in the post-ballot phase yet, but in that kind of context, the encounter is like, it can be years, right? And there are all these like sub things that happen, some of which are more administrative, but need to be broken up as like a reassessment. And that was sort of the model that they used, was to form they called them reassessment time point encounters that helped collect all the information that was relevant for, say, this sort of mid-encounter assessment period, and then kind of link them all together in a batch. But it's a really sort of tricky space. But the hard part was the definition around encounter varied so much by various clinical entities, sort of, that it was hard to get agreement. Yeah.
And so, I mean, one of the things that should be clear from this discussion is that using a composition to organize your thinking and link all your resources together is doing something different than using a micro encounter and linking them all to the encounter. Exactly. So you might do both, or just choose one of those two approaches. So
I think, sorry, Graham, I think another one on this list could be questionnaire, no? It can reference to resources as well.
Can it?
Just under communication, yeah. Maybe we can use basic. No, and another use case I was thinking of is that I participated
Go on.
people with a chronic disease, and there was a protocolized set of tests and so on that had to be done, say, every half year, and they really wanted these set of tests done over, say, a week to be combined into a thing. So you could follow this every time. They had protocolized and given each of these compositions actual names. So, you know, during a 4-year period, you would have composition T1, T2, T3, and that had a specific set of research that needed to be done. And so I think composition would work for that as well.
Could do, yeah. All right. So moving on then, how do you describe what's going on, say, in an implementation guide? So you can do that by a structure definition, which links to a bunch of other structure definitions by specifying profiles and target elements. We have implementation guides that do that right now. They can be kind of hard to read, but we do have some examples. Where's mine here? The M-code patient bundle, for instance, is a profile on bundle that specifies some entries that are particular resources. That's the snapshot, so it's a bit hard to consume. But in fact, a decent profile on this M code would start slicing, specifying all other slices, and it gets to be a very long list. It's very hard to consume. Here's the differential for a composition profile from the breast radiology reporting resource. These guys, I couldn't find it when I was looking earlier a couple of hours ago, but these guys produced a resource, a differential that they posted to Julep a couple of years ago. It was about 25,000 pixels long, given that there's about 500 on the screen. The differential was enormous because they were just trying to do everything in a profile, and profiles are intentionally verbose because you're actually profiling the elements of the resources. So it's really hard to see a picture overall. So I did do something about this a long time ago. Let's see if I can find this. So then what we did was, oh, it's gone away. File. Well, that's interesting. I was going to show you something I did, but it's gone. So then after talking about this, how many years ago did we talk about this? We were in Norway, you and I.
In the car in Norway, driving from Bergen to Oslo, I think.
We were, yes. What a fun trip that was too. So we talked about this and the need to describe sets of resources. And out of the very long discussion we had on that trip, I did 2 pieces of work. The first was GraphQL, which is a way for a client to dance across a bunch of resources and pull information selectively out of them and ask for the server to assemble that into a single JSON document that the client then feeds into its view. Given how useful and powerful that is as a technique, I'm surprised that it's not more used within the implementation community. It intrigues me that people don't do it more. But having said that, it's orthogonal to our problem. It's basically a language to front load work the client could do for itself, and probably pretty much normally does, and just get the server to do it on behalf of the client in advance. It doesn't speak to semantics. It doesn't tell you anything about what's going on underneath. It just shortcuts everything for the client. And the other thing that I did was graph definition. So where is it gone? Graph definition is a resource that also hasn't gone many places. There's parts of the community that really, really like it a lot, and other parts that go, meh, we don't see the need. But basically, graph definition assumes that you have a network of resources profiled by structure definitions that talk about how you talk about each of the individual resources, but graph definition talks about the property of the graph that links them all. And so you can do a variety of things with the graph definition. One thing you can do is that you can just give an overview of a set of resources that the relationships are defined by the profiles, but you can't see the wood for the trees because you're looking at all the trees individually. So the graph definition can say, this is the overall picture of the profiles, the view that they build. Or you can actually use it to fetch a graph. You can say, well, I'm fetching the patient, and from the patient, I want to fetch his observations, and from each observation, I want to fetch the practitioners, and then say to a server, given this graph of resources, just give them all to me. Or you can say, I want the true that all these resources are resources you hold, and they're all about the same patient. And so you can actually say, make rules about the set of resources that a server holds and require the server or test the server. Do you actually have all of this information? Because the server might say, yeah, I got the patient record and I've got the observations. I don't know anything about the practitioners. You can say, do you have the whole graph? Or do you have broken links in the graph? So those are some of the things you can do with the graph definition, or you can specify what goes in a document. Because the rules for turning a composition into the document is that anything directly linked in the composition goes in the document. But anything that's not directly linked, anything that's referred to by things that are referred to by the composition, it's the document author's, what's the word I'm looking for? Discretion, whether to put that in the document. Where the graph definition, you can say, I want you to put this graph and specify which of those things to follow up and add to the document beyond the things you have to put in the document. So that's graph definition. We haven't, it's still maturity level has gone up to 1, awesome. But we haven't got a lot of use of it. We've had some connectathons around using it as a document construction controller. I think that's it at the moment. It's not actually very hard to implement as an engine. It's pretty straightforward. You just keep iterating on the rules until you run out of links, and then you decide whether that's a problem or not. So that's currently what we have for describing a set of relationships. But then when I look through implementation guides, I'll see things like this. People trying to give you like a top-down perspective on what's in a document. So I have a proposal to make, and then we can have discussion. I think that we should have, and then we do have profiles on documents, a bundle with a composition, and like that's what this is, a bundle with a composition. No, this is not. This is just one piece of it. Where is it here? A bundle on a composition. A profile on a composition that would go in a bundle. It tells you which of these things to assemble in your work. What I think we need is a new resource called composition definition. And in the composition definition resource, it's kind of a bit like a graph definition, but it describes the composition. So it gives the code and a title for the composition and a category, and it's kind of profiling stuff. So it's a little bit overlapping with profile, but then it says, is this a composition that would be a document? Or is this a composition that, you know, is an EHR contribution? Or is this contribution that's, given the discussion we've had, a holding space to slowly accrete information. So you're moving beyond what is in the composition and talking about the properties of the composition. And then you can talk about what kind of roles create this composition, who's going to attest it, why does the composition happen, what's its workflow context. And so you've moved there, you've right beyond profiling information towards workflow information about the document. You can link to evidence for why you've built the composition this way. So it's like clinical evidence, research papers, so forth. You can talk about the confidentiality and security expectations for the composition, what rights are required to perform, to build it maybe. And then you can actually positively describe the sections, the code, the title, the rules about the participations. Do they have to be the same author, the same focus? What kind of resources go in them? And so actually, you know, I showed you this, kind of actually that's what you're building, right? What are the sections? What are the findings in the resources in the sections? And what subsections are they? And what rules do you have around whether the content is populated and how much of the content is populated? One of my favorite questions, this comes up for me in multiple contexts, is you're specifying that you're going to have a document summary of a patient that includes their vital signs. And you're reporting out of a system that includes an ICU. So you've got approximately 1 million vital signs. Which ones are you going to include? Which ones should be included? Do you care? Do you want them all 1 million of them? Because that's what there was, one for every second you're in ICU. Or do you want the most recent or the daily? Or there's a bunch of rules that really matter around building those things. And I've come into that multiple times. And so kind of my proposal is that we could benefit at this level from being able to positively describe compositions, whereas at the moment we can basically only negatively want to profile them by inference and then infer the meaning and the structure of them from the profile. So that's kind of what I wanted to show you and see what everybody said about that idea. Over to you, Ewout.
Yes, I'll drop this first. Yeah, Graham, I think what you're describing is exactly what we've been thinking about and looking for in terms of how we would want to implement generation of IPS documents on, you know, from a basic, you know, EHR. And I was talking about this with James, you know, last night with regard to Happy, how we might, you know, actually implement the back end of summary for generating IPS. And it's exactly this kind of thing we want to do. We want to create a set of rules about, you know, out of this whole set of data that's available, what do we need to pull into this document and how do we do it? And I've been thinking about, you know, how we might, you know, if we could leverage some stuff with graph definition and all of that to help. And we were talking about just, you know, using some program code, you know, behind the scenes to kind of build these rules. But it sounds like this composition definition that you're describing might be a lot of what we're wanting to explore. So I think it's pretty cool, actually. So, I don't know, does that make sense what I'm saying? And do you have any other thoughts about that? You know?
No, but that's exactly the kind of use that's led me to thinking about this. Is you know, automated document generation. It sounds really cool in principle to look at a big patient record and go, what do we do with this?
Hi, Graham, Mark Kramer. So
Mark.
I'm getting confused again. Hi. I'm getting confused between a profile on composition and the composition definition. And I guess in general between the definitional things and the profiles of things. Could you help me out?
So they're related. And we have a working metaphor for the relationship between the two in the difference between an observation definition and a profile on observation. Have you looked at that question? Because the code and the title and the specific sections are overlapping with profile. In the same way, the observation definition overlaps with an implied profile on observation. But it becomes different because you're actually moving into a different space and talking about the construction of the composition rather than just what's in it. And so they do overlap a bit as I've proposed them, and you could propose a different scope a little bit, which reduces the overlap. That would be something we could discuss about. But for me, it's the really different thing is that you're actually talking about the document rather than the content of the composition that represents the document.
I'm a big fan of this, partially because I'm creating an entire FHIR IG to do exactly this using logical models. And I would really like it if there was a resource that made my IG obsolete and could just be done instantly. The one ad I have is in the logical models, I'm defining what the query terms are to pull a resource. So I use FHIR path to pull in, say, okay, I want all of these that belong to this value set, or all of these that, you know, are from this specific code or from this specific time. So being able to say, you know, not just what kinds of resources, but specifically how you would query for them would be a big add for a composition definition.
Yeah, the building instructions. I've prototyped this a little bit with a couple of other people, and we've got a few languages that you could play around with. You could do something with URL query. You could do stuff with FHIR path. You do stuff with CQL. You could do some really low-level, low-hanging fruit around dates and ranges and codes and statuses. But at some point you go, yeah, we need to break out into a really expressive language, and haven't done a lot of work on trying to figure out how you would, you know, best do that.
Graham, okay, it also feels like it means the name now is composition definition, but it feels like also like an extraction definition. Would that be also a way to see this, or?
Well, it could be, but and maybe you pull out the building instructions into a separate extraction definition that's more reusable, because extraction definition implies a kind of more generically reusable scope. So maybe that's something that we would do. Maybe a subset. I don't know, resource selection criteria extraction. I don't know, something. Because that you don't only do that when you're building a composition and sub-selecting some stuff that already exists, right?
So with message definition, we leverage graph definition to define what are the resources that are included and what are their relationships. And it seems to me that for composition definition, we're going to want to make similar kinds of statements, that the entries in this particular section need to have this type of relationship to the entries in that section. And so how much do you envision of the constraints on the entries and the hierarchy of the sections would be managed in composition definition, and how much of that is actually better handled in graph definition?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this still is focused on composition and its immediate relationships, and you would go further by getting into graph definition space. But profiling the sections, no, I think that if you went further than that, you would say graph definition, but profiling the sections like this is not in the scope of graph definition. So whether you'd have a single graph definition and jump into points in it, or, I don't know, we'd talk about that. There's definitely some relationship between the two, like there is with profile as well.
Yeah, what would be the, say, if people have both graph definition and composition definition in their hands, when would you clearly use the one and when the other, Graham?
Well, graph definition tells you about the relationship between the composition and its wider things. And maybe, so you could do some of what this is doing with a structure definition and a graph definition. The structure definition for the composition and the graph definition telling you how far to chase outside the immediate links. The composition definition doesn't relate to how far to chase outside the immediate links. And you could say that the composition definition is really a decoration on a structure definition, a profile of the section that just adds a bunch of other stuff about the document, sorry, about the composition on top of the profile. I don't feel particularly strongly about that. So you could argue that actually composition definition is a profile and structure definition with a bunch of extensions that build out all this extra information. I don't feel strongly about that. I just think that we need to actually get hold of and describe compositions. And I'm glad that we've heard some support for the idea.
Yeah, I think it seems like the relation between composition definition and structure definition is, sure, you could do this with a structure definition, much like you could use structure definition to do what you do with questionnaire, but it's pretty user unfriendly.
Yeah, you could. I mean, I think, like I said, I think the working thing that we should be thinking about is observation definition, which starts with a category and a code. And that overlaps with the profile on observation, but actually then it heads off to talk about actually the observation rather than the profile of the observation resource. And they're actually quite different things. And for me, it's basically pursuing that idea of what is it that makes a composition, as opposed to what does a particular composition look like.
Right. It would also add a little bit of that context to the, reading a composition definition would give you a little bit of the context of what is in implicit context of what is in that composition, right?
Yeah. Why do we have this composition? What's in it? How do you build it? And what are the expectations for why you put stuff in there?
Would a composition definition essentially impart some, would a composition become hard to read without the accommodating or without the accompanying definition resource?
It would be very much against our typical culture to go back to composition definition and say, we'll replace the composition metadata code and so forth with a reference to the composition definition. So if you don't have the composition definition, you're all at sea. We do have some resources that work like that. In particular, questionnaire response is particularly hard to do anything with if you don't have the questionnaire that led to it. But in most cases, no, we're not going to remove things from observation because we have observation definition. We're not going to remove things from composition because we have a composition definition, because we expect that those things are interpretable standalone without necessarily having to find the definition.
I guess that's all for the questions here, as far as I can see. Well, actually, we're at time. So that's...
Thanks, everybody.
Nearly time. Yeah, thanks for the stimulating ideas. And we know how these kind of things goes. These will mature a little bit in our heads, and we'll definitely talk about this again at some next meeting, probably September or whenever. Yes, thank you, Grahame.
Yeah, we might noodle on it in a phone call and on Julep in the meantime. But yeah, definitely I want to talk about it in September. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot.